The hallway buzzed with the steady rhythm of a joint bass, morning boots striking tile, radios crackling, officers exchanging clipped greetings. In the middle of it all, a woman in plain civilian clothes stood quietly, holding a small notebook at her side. Colonel Marcus Reddington spotted her immediately and let out a sharp laugh, loud enough for every passing officer to hear. "Our new consultant," he announced, voice dripping with mock respect. "Let's see if she lasts even 1 hour on an active base." A few soldiers chuckled, quick and nervous, eager to match the colonel's mood. Others shifted uncomfortably, pretending to focus on their paperwork as the sting of the moment settled into the air. Grace Callahan didn't flinch. She simply nodded once, her expression calm and unreadable, as if the insult hadn't touched her at all. That composure drew more attention than any reaction could have. Petty Officer Jonah Reeves, leaning against a doorway, watched her with narrowed eyes. Her posture, her stillness, none of it matched the role she appeared to play. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Grace Callahan blended into the background on purpose. She wore a simple light gray blouse, dark slacks, and flat shoes that made no sound on the polished floor. Her hair was pulled back in a plain, functional twist, and the only thing in her hand was a small black notebook with no markings at all. If you passed her in a crowded airport, you would not remember her face an hour later. Captain Eric Lawson walked half a step ahead of her, badge clipped to his uniform, trying to match his pace to hers. At first glance, he filed her away as another civilian inspector from some office in Washington, the kind that showed up, filled out forms, and disappeared again. But within a few steps, he noticed something that did not fit. She did not wander. She did not hesitate. Her posture was straight without being stiff, shoulders relaxed but square, head level. She moved with the easy balance of someone who had spent years carrying weight, reading terrain, and counting distances without thinking about it. Even when they paused at a junction while a squad of soldiers marched by, her feet stayed planted at just the right angle, like she was always aware of the space around her. Lawson glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Most civilians flinched at the bark of a sergeant's command or the sudden slam of a door. Grace did neither. The shout, the noise, the movement of uniforms around her seemed to slide past without disturbing the calm at the center of her chest. Her breathing never changed rhythm. "Ma'am," Lawson said politely, gesturing toward a doorway, "the colonel is waiting in the conference room. He likes to start briefings on the dot." Grace gave a small nod. "Then we should not keep him waiting, Captain," she replied, voice even and low. There was no apology in her tone, no rush, just a quiet acceptance of timing as a fact, not a threat. Inside the conference room, a few staff officers stood around a large digital map, murmuring over training schedules and fuel reports. Their conversation dipped the instant Lawson and Grace stepped through the door. Major Laura Bennett, the operations officer, looked up first. Her eyes flicked over Grace's clothes, her notebook, then moved on, already filing the visitor under the label of temporary inconvenience. Colonel Marcus Reddington did not bother to hide his reaction. He was leaning over the table, finger pressed on a highlighted route, when Lawson cleared his throat. The colonel straightened, turned, and let his gaze run slowly from Grace's shoes to her eyes. He did not see rank, patches, or any hint of authority that mattered to him. "So, this is our consultant," he said, drawing out the last word. "Welcome to the real world, ma'am." The way he leaned on the last word made it sound less like courtesy and more like a private joke. Grace met his eyes for a moment, then inclined her head just enough to acknowledge the greeting. "Thank you for taking the time, Colonel," she said. Her voice stayed calm, her expression neutral. She did not try to fill the silence or prove herself. Around the room, a few lieutenants exchanged quick looks. Civilians came and went all the time, running checklists, nodding sagely at things they did not understand. This one looked no different. No uniform, no visible insignia, no obvious connection to anything that mattered in the chain of command. In their minds, she might as well have been from an insurance company. Reddington gestured toward an empty chair near the far end of the table. "Have a seat right there, ma'am. We will try to keep the big words slow and simple." Laughter rippled lightly through a couple of officers. the kind of laughter that rode on loyalty more than genuine humor. Grace sat without comment, placing her notebook flat in front of her. She did not fidget, did not tap a pen or straighten her papers. Her hands rested lightly on the table, fingers relaxed. Lawson took a position against the wall, close enough to answer questions, far enough to watch. The briefing began with the usual slides. Training completion rates, equipment readiness percentages, personnel status. Reddington spoke with rehearsed confidence, barely glancing at his notes. "As you can see, ma'am, our numbers are some of the best in the region," he said. "You will not find much to complain about here." Grace listened without interrupting, eyes moving between the screen and the faces in the room. When he paused for a reaction, she leaned forward slightly. "The readiness rate on your tactical vehicles," she said, "does that percentage include those currently listed as awaiting major parts, or are those removed from the count?" The room went still for a half-second. That was not the kind of question a surface-level inspector usually asked. Major Bennett blinked and glanced at Reddington. Adjust for long-term maintenance, ma'am," the colonel replied. "You do not need to worry about the fine print. The system accounts for it automatically." Grace made a small note in her book. "Respectfully, I would like to see the list of vehicles awaiting major components later," she said. Her tone did not challenge. It simply stated an intention. Bennett studied her a little more carefully now. The question had been precise, the language technical enough to suggest more than casual familiarity. Civilians often threw around buzzwords. This woman had zero wasted words. As the briefing moved on, Grace asked about training schedules, casualty evacuation drills, and the rotation of night duty. Each time, her questions slid past surface numbers and touched the structure underneath. She asked how many soldiers had been pulled from long-term training for urgent cosmetic tasks. She asked how often communications equipment was tested under stress, not just powered on. Reddington's smile grew tighter with each follow-up. "You have done some reading, ma'am," he said finally, his voice just shy of condescending. "Good to see that enthusiasm." Outside the conference room later that morning, Grace and Lawson walked along a row of barracks. She watched a formation break and scatter, catching small details. A sergeant rubbing his temples like he had not slept. A private adjusting a radio with tape holding the antenna in place. Two specialists exchanging a glance when a senior leader walked past, their posture stiffening a fraction too late. Lawson pointed out facilities as they moved. "Motor pool to your left, ma'am. Dining facility straight ahead. We will meet Command Sergeant Major Holt near the range after lunch." Grace nodded, but her eyes were elsewhere. She noticed paint peeling around a door that was always supposed to be sealed. She noticed the way a young corporal flinched when a staff officer raised his voice across the lot. None of it screamed disaster on its own. Taken together, the pattern felt wrong. As they approached a doorway, Grace's hand drifted for a moment toward her left wrist. Beneath the cuff of her blouse, a narrow metal bracelet pressed cool against her skin. The etched anchor and wings on it were faint from years of wear, the kind of bracelet sailors and aviators sometimes wore for those they had flown with and lost. Her fingertips brushed the edge for a single heartbeat, grounding herself in its familiar weight. Then, as Lawson glanced back at her, she slipped her hand away and smoothed her sleeve, hiding the metal entirely. The gesture was so small, most people would have missed it. Petty Officer Jonah Reeves, watching from the far end of the corridor, did not. By the second morning, Colonel Marcus Reddington had turned the daily update brief into his own private stage show. He stood at the head of the table, sleeves rolled just enough to show off forearms he thought looked rugged, pacing slowly as the projector hummed behind him. Grace sat in the same seat as before, notebook closed, hands folded. She did not look impressed, threatened, or bored. She simply watched. "As I was saying, ma'am," Reddington drawled, pointing to a slide full of colored bars, "this is what we call a perimeter. That means the outside edge where we keep the bad guys from getting in." A faint, forced laugh rolled around the room. The officers knew he was not explaining it for their benefit. Grace blinked once. "I am familiar with the concept of a perimeter, Colonel," she said quietly. He smiled like a man humoring a child. "Of course you are. Just making sure we are all on the same page. would not want to lose you in the complex military jargon." The words sounded light, but his eyes were sharp, measuring the reaction he could provoke. Each time Major Bennett began to explain a training issue, Reddington cut across her. "Let me take this one, Major," he said, stepping forward. "What you need to know, ma'am, is that our readiness is essentially flawless." He slapped the slide changer, revealing another graph that climbed nearly to the top. "See those numbers? That is called excellence. We do not miss." Grace studied the chart. "How often are these numbers independently verified?" she asked. Reddington's jaw tightened a fraction. "The system verifies itself," he replied, voice smooth. "Our reports are accepted all the way up. Trust me, if there were a problem, someone would have said something by now." In the corner of her eye, she saw Bennett's mouth press into a thin line. Command Sergeant Major Dean Holt sat with his elbows on his knees, staring at his folded hands like he wanted to speak, but had swallowed the habit long ago. The pattern repeated throughout the morning. An officer would start to answer honestly, mention a minor issue or a delay, and Reddington would slide in front of them with a polished, rehearsed correction. He never quite called his staff wrong in front of Grace. Instead, he rephrased, softened, and polished their words into something that fit the picture he wanted her to see. To most outsiders, it might have looked like confident leadership. To Grace, it looked like someone terrified of an unedited truth. Later, in a cramped communications room that smelled faintly of dust and burnt circuits, Grace sat across from Staff Sergeant Caleb Brooks. The young NCO had dark circles under her eyes and grease smudges along the back of her hands, like she wiped them on her fatigues without thinking. Reddington had been there at the start of the meeting, leaning against a cabinet, arms folded. "Sergeant Brooks runs a tight ship," he said loudly. "No issues in this shop. Radios are solid, networks are solid, response times are solid." "Right, Sergeant?" "Yes, sir," Brooks answered, voice clipped. "We do our best." He clapped his hand against the metal casing. "Her best is good enough for me. I will let you two taunt details." He gave Grace a meaningful smile before walking out, leaving the door half open. For several seconds after his footsteps faded, Brooks stared at the doorway like she expected him to come back. Grace waited. Silence settled between them, thick but not uncomfortable. She could hear the low hum of cooling fans, the distant echo of marching boots from outside. She watched Brooks's shoulders slowly drop an inch. "Sergeant," Grace said softly, "earlier the colonel described your radios as solid. Would you use the same word?" Brooks hesitated, her fingers drummed once on her knee, then stopped. "Officially, ma'am, our comm status is green," she said, "on paper. In the system," she swallowed, "off the record, we have units rolling out with gear that should have been replaced years ago." Grace did not change expression. "How often do you lose contact during training?" "More than the reports say," Brooks replied, eyes flicking to the doorway again. "Range 3 is bad. The relay kicks out when it gets too hot, and we do not have the parts to fix it, so we patch, reset, and hope. Sometimes calls do not go through when they should." Grace wrote nothing down yet. "Do your soldiers know this?" she asked. "They know enough to not trust the numbers," Brooks answered. "But no one wants to be the name on the form that says we are not as ready as the colonel says we are." When they finished, Grace thanked her and stepped into the hallway with Captain Lawson. His jaw was tight. He had heard enough to understand what Brooks was really saying. "She is good at her job," Grace murmured. "She is one of the best," Lawson replied quietly, "and she is tired of pretending broken gear is fine." On the way to the motor pool, they met Command Sergeant Major Holt. He was a broad man with a lined face and the kind of calm that only came from decades of watching young soldiers cycle through the same gates year after year. He shook Grace's hand with respectful politeness. "Ma'am," he said, "I understand you want to hear about the troops." "If you do not mind," Grace replied, "in your own words." They sat at a metal table outside the dining facility. Soldiers moved past carrying trays, their voices low, their movements automatic. Holt glanced at them with the protective instinct of someone who knew too many of their stories. "On the record," he said, "this unit meets standards, training is full." Tasks are completed. We are mission capable. His words sounded like they came straight from a regulation. Grace let a breath slip slowly out of her lungs. "And in your experience?" she asked. Holt's eyes met hers. For a second, something like recognition flickered there, as if he saw not just a consultant, but someone who understood the weight of command. He looked down at his hands. "Morale is complicated," he said carefully. "The colonel believes in results. He pushes hard. Some soldiers thrive under that, some do not." He paused, weighing each word. "Folks are proud of their work. They just do not feel like there is much room to say when something is wrong." "Because?" Grace prompted gently. "Because people who talk too much tend to find themselves reassigned," Holt said, "or suddenly on every undesirable duty you can imagine. Word travels, so people keep their heads down, do their jobs, and hope nothing breaks at the wrong time." He glanced toward the headquarters building where Reddington's office sat like a watchtower. "You did not hear that from me, ma'am," he added. Grace nodded. "Understood." That afternoon, Reddington insisted she observe a field training exercise. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that made shadows sharp and heat shimmer on the horizon. Soldiers moved across the training area in full gear, voices crackling over radios as they executed a simulated convoy scenario. Grace stood beside Lawson on a small rise, her eyes tracking movement with practiced ease. Reddington strode back and forth behind them, narrating events as if he were calling a sports game. "You see that, ma'am?" "Textbook maneuver," he said. "My people moved through that choke point in record time." Downrange, a vehicle stalled in the worst possible spot, throwing the whole sequence off. The radio net erupted with overlapping calls. For a moment, confusion rippled through the formation as two leaders gave conflicting instructions. Instead of letting the junior leaders work through the friction, Reddington snatched a radio from a nearby sergeant. "Interact together, Alpha," he barked into the handset, loud enough for Grace and every soldier within earshot to hear. "You are embarrassing this unit in front of our guest." The air went brittle. He turned to Grace, face flushed with irritation. "You see what I mean about needing to keep a firm hand, ma'am?" he said. "They know better. They just need a reminder sometimes." Grace watched as the stalled vehicle finally lurched back into motion, dust billowing around its tires. She noticed the way one squad leader's shoulders sagged as the colonel's words settled over the net. "What was the training objective for this lane?" she asked. "To test their reaction under pressure," Reddington replied. "Do you feel they learned more from the scenario?" Grace said quietly, "or from being shouted at over the radio?" His eyes hardened. "In this line of work, ma'am, embarrassment is a powerful teacher," he snapped. "If they do not like it, they can find another uniform." Several soldiers nearby heard every word. Lawson shifted his weight, discomfort plain on his face. He had been in enough units to know there was a difference between hard training and public humiliation. Watching Grace stand there, completely calm while the colonel used her presence as a weapon, made something twist in his chest. He glanced at her, expecting at least a flicker of anger. Instead, he saw the same steady focus he had seen since day one. Her jaw was relaxed, eyes narrowed slightly against the glare, tracking the unit's movement. She was not ignoring Reddington's behavior. She was measuring it. Down the slope, Petty Officer Jonah Reeves moved between observation points, checking line of sight and distance markers. When he reached the rise where Grace stood, he paused for a moment, pretending to adjust his rangefinder. As the next phase of the exercise began, the group shifted positions. There were exposed cables, uneven ground, and scattered equipment around their feet. Most people stepped where they happened to look. Grace did not. Without breaking her gaze from the training lane, she stepped cleanly over a loose coil of wire, skirted a half-buried rock, and repositioned herself with the reflexive care of someone who had spent years moving through dangerous spaces where one careless footfall could be the last. Reeves watched that small sequence with interest. The way she scanned the area without obviously looking down. The way she always seemed to find solid footing. That was not how office inspectors walked. That was how people who had led troops through real hazards walked. Reddington continued to talk, filling the air with commentary about his own leadership. "They know I do not tolerate weakness," he said. "You have to be willing to break a few egos if you want results." Grace said nothing. And maybe that is where the real question lies for anyone listening to this story. What would you have done in that moment? Would you have stayed quiet like so many did? Or spoken up for the person being used as a prop for someone else's ego? Back in the Tactical Operations Center later that day, Grace stood at the edge of the room while after-action discussions began. Officers spoke cautiously, adjusting their language when they felt Reddington's eyes on them. Every time someone admitted a flaw, he reframed it as a minor glitch already solved. Grace watched the dance in silence, her notebook still closed. She had seen enough commands to recognize the pattern now. Fear wrapped in confidence. Control disguised as standard. Respect demanded, not earned. And through it all, she moved like what she truly was, even though no one knew it yet. A woman who understood the cost when leadership failed, and who had not come here just to watch. The next morning brought the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the firing lanes. Grace stood several feet behind the safety line as soldiers prepared for a live-fire drill. The sharp crack of rifles echoed across the range, punctuated by shouted commands and the clatter of magazines hitting the ground. Most observers struggled to follow the controlled chaos, the movements blurred into noise and dust. But Grace's eyes tracked every detail with silent precision. She followed the rhythm of fire, 2 seconds too slow on lane 4, timing off by half a beat on lane 7, a hesitated reload that could have cost someone their life in a real engagement. She didn't write anything down. She didn't need to. Petty Officer Jonah Reeves stepped up beside her, arms crossed, watching the same drill. A young private walked past them, overhearing Reeves mutter under his breath, "That woman moves like command staff." The private glanced back at Grace, frowning, and kept walking. Rumors were already beginning to spread. When the firing concluded and the teams cleared their weapons, Grace followed Captain Lawson and Major Bennett into the tactical operations room for the next briefing. The map table dominated the center, covered with laminated overlays, markers, and red-blue symbols showing unit positions for the upcoming field maneuver. Bennett leaned over the table, adjusting a corner of the top overlay. She didn't notice the misalignment until she traced a route and saw it veer into the wrong sector. Before she could correct it, Grace reached out with a single smooth motion. She lifted the plastic sheet, realigned the grid, and set it down in perfect orientation in one precise movement. The correction took 2 seconds, fast, silent, automatic. Bennett's eyebrows rose. "You've handled these before," she said before catching herself. Grace simply nodded once. "A map is only useful if it tells the truth," she replied. Reddington entered the room right then. He didn't see the exchange, but he sensed a shift, the subtle difference in how people looked at her now. It rubbed against his pride like sandpaper. "Still here, ma'am," he said. "Most consultants are satisfied by this point. You must enjoy the scenery." Grace's expression didn't change. "There are still areas I need to review." Reddington smirked, as if he had expected no less. But there was an uneasy flicker in his eyes now, something like wariness. A supply sergeant brought in an outdated tactical radio for inspection. The unit was the kind they had retired years ago on naval air stations, bulky and prone to overheating. Grace turned it slowly in her hands, fingers brushing across the vents and dials with the familiarity of someone who had once depended on equipment like this in life-or-death moments. "This model was never meant for desert heat," she murmured. "It trips the internal limiter once the board hits 200 degrees. Her voice was soft, but Lawson heard every word. He stared at her. Only someone with aviation or shipboard ops experience would know that detail. Definitely not a civilian consultant. Grace realized she'd said too much and handed the radio back calmly. "Just an observation," she said. They moved to the next room where soldiers were packing gear for the afternoon's movement. As Lawson held the door open, Grace reached for it with her left hand. The shifting light caught her sleeve just right, and for a split second, he saw it. A thin, pale scar ran along the inside of her forearm. Not a decorative mark, not accidental. A long-healed wound, the kind left by metal or shrapnel, the kind that took stitching and time and silence to forget. She tugged her sleeve down instantly, the motion fluid but controlled. Lawson didn't say a word, but the image stayed with him. No one with a desk job had a scar like that. By midday, Grace's calm presence was starting to have an unintended effect on the base. Soldiers watched her walk past with quiet curiosity. Officers hesitated before dismissing her questions. Even Major Bennett, who had been neutral from the beginning, now studied her with the caution one reserves for someone who might outrank everyone in the room. Reddington, however, grew more irritated with each passing hour. He approached Lawson near the motor pool and spoke just loud enough for Grace to hear. "Why is she still digging?" he demanded. "A consultant doesn't need this level of access. What is she after?" Lawson kept his tone respectful. "She's just doing her job, sir," Reddington snorted. "No. She's too calm." He jabbed a finger toward Grace, who was talking quietly with two NCOs. "She stands like someone who thinks she owns the place. She looks people in the eye like she's judging them." He shook his head. "Something is off." Grace walked toward them at that moment, posture steady, notebook tucked under her arm. Reddington plastered on a smile, loud and confident once again. "Ready for another exciting tour, ma'am?" he asked. She nodded politely. But behind the colonel's forced cheer was something new: uncertainty. He couldn't have explained it if asked, but some part of him sensed what others were beginning to see. The woman he'd been mocking for days didn't move, speak, or carry herself like someone beneath him. She moved like someone who didn't need to prove anything. And that, more than anything else, unsettled him. The comms blackout happened on a Wednesday afternoon, though later many soldiers would swear it felt like the base was holding its breath long before the alarm sounded. It started with a sharp crack of static, then a choking silence that swallowed the entire tactical operations center. Screens froze. Radios died mid-sentence. Even the status board flickered before dimming completely. Major Bennett snapped her head up from the console. "That wasn't scheduled," she said, her voice tight. Captain Lawson immediately grabbed a handset, tapping through frequencies, but each line returned nothing but dead air. "All channels are down, ma'am," he said. "Primary, secondary, fallback, everything's out." Around them, officers and enlisted techs sprang into motion. Chairs scraped. Fingers hammered keyboards. A low rush of tension swept through the room as the blackout spread to the secondary monitoring stations. All communication between units, convoys, and perimeter points had gone blind. Colonel Reddington stormed into the TOC, irritation flooding his expression. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, voice sharp enough to jolt a junior lieutenant. "Sir, full comms failure across the grid," Bennett replied. "No known cause yet." Reddington glared at the screens as if sheer anger could restart them. "Get it fixed," he barked. "I don't care how." Grace Callahan stood near the far wall, hands clasped lightly in front of her, gaze calm as she watched the frantic movements. Unlike everyone else, she didn't lunge for a device, didn't panic, didn't start flipping through troubleshooting flowcharts posted on the wall. She simply observed. Lawson tried one more frequency, adjusting the antenna angle. Still nothing. "This shouldn't be possible," he muttered under his breath. Even under stress testing, Phase 3 relays don't all collapse at once. Grace stepped closer, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "You're using the wrong fallback path, Captain." Lawson froze mid-movement. Grace leaned in slightly, eyes fixed on the array of dormant screens. "The blackout isn't system-wide. It's localized at the relay hub behind the western training grid. Reroute through the secondary subloop and bounce the signal through the east sector node." Lawson stared at her. "Ma'am, that's not even in the standard manual." "No," she agreed quietly, "it isn't." For 2 seconds, Lawson hesitated. Then he typed her instructions into the console with quick, precise keystrokes. The moment the final command executed, a ripple of green lights blinked back to life across the board. One by one, every screen lit. Radios crackled. Signal bars returned. Status icons flashed from red to amber to green. The room froze in collective disbelief. Bennett turned sharply toward Lawson. "How did you do that?" Reddington stepped forward, jaw hanging open, then snapping shut. His voice came out strained. "Yes, Captain. How exactly did you manage that miracle?" Lawson swallowed once and said nothing. Grace stood beside him, expression unreadable. She didn't smile. She didn't acknowledge what she had done. She simply stepped back into the same quiet posture she always carried. Bennett's eyes drifted slowly to Grace, tracking her as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Her brow furrowed, confusion edging into suspicion. No civilian consultant in the world would know how to bypass a collapsed relay grid, let alone in seconds. Staff Sergeant Caleb Brooks rushed into the TOC, breathless. "Sir, comms are back online across all sectors. We're stable." "Whatever happened, it's fixed." Reddington seized the moment. "Of course it's fixed," he said loudly. "I authorized our backup reroute plan myself. Good work, everyone." But no one looked at him. Not Bennett, not Lawson. Not the techs who had watched the woman in gray step forward with the certainty of someone who had solved crises far more dangerous than this one. Reeves slipped through the doorway, drawn by the sudden surge of activity. He scanned the room quickly, noting the revived equipment, the silence of shock hanging over the officers, and finally the calm figure near the wall. A slow, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He had suspected since the first day, but now? Now he was nearly certain. Grace Callahan did not look like someone borrowing authority. She looked like someone who owned it. Reddington strode toward her, planting himself in her path with a forced confidence. "Well, ma'am," he said, voice edged with sarcasm he couldn't fully control, "seems you've been getting quite the show here. Our people don't panic under pressure." "Good to see." Grace met his eyes with quiet patience. "Your people handled it as best they could with the information they had. And you?" he asked, trying to regain footing. "You seem awfully calm during a major systems failure." "Panic doesn't help restore functionality, Colonel," she replied. He opened his mouth to say something else, but the words faltered. Something in her steady gaze unsettled him, a calmness that didn't belong to an outsider, a certainty that came from experience earned the hard way. Grace turned without waiting for his next comment and walked out of the TOC. She left the room in a silence so thick it pressed against the walls. Bennett exhaled slowly. Lawson rubbed the back of his neck, replaying her instructions in his mind, each step flawless, immediate, and unmistakably operational. Reeves stepped beside Bennett. "Whoever she is," he murmured, "she's not what she's pretending to be." Bennett didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the doorway Grace had disappeared through. Within 20 minutes, whispers spread across the base. "She fixed the blackout." "No, Lawson did." "No," she told him. "How?" "What civilian knows relay grids? I heard she used to be in special operations." "No, she's definitely Navy." "Then why is she here?" Questions flew through hallways, barracks, comm shacks, and break rooms. Every whispered theory only deepened the mystery. And somewhere near the command building, Colonel Reddington watched Grace walk across the courtyard with quiet steps and straight posture. For the first time since she arrived, he felt something unfamiliar when he looked at her. Not irritation, not disdain, but unease. A cold, creeping sense that he had underestimated someone profoundly important and that the consequences were waiting just beyond the horizon. On the final morning, the sky hung low and gray over the joint base, as if the weather itself sensed the shift coming. Grace walked into headquarters with her usual calm steps and handed a simple request through Lawson. She needed a private meeting with Colonel Reddington before she left the installation. The colonel did not take the request well. He stormed into the small briefing room where she waited, the door slamming against the stopper hard enough to rattle the glass. "Ma'am," he barked, drawing out the word like a weapon, "I have an entire base to run. If this is another set of pointless questions, I'm afraid you're wasting my valuable military time." Grace stood beside the table, notebook closed, hands lightly resting on its surface. "Colonel Reddington," she said, "this won't take long." He scoffed, striding toward her with exaggerated confidence. "It better not. I have 3 training cycles to supervise today, and I cannot babysit a consultant who spent the week nitpicking things she doesn't understand." Before Grace could answer, the door opened again. Petty Officer Jonah Reeves stepped inside, unexpected, out of breath, and carrying a sealed envelope marked with a thick red stripe. The wax seal bore the crest of the United States Navy, and across the front were the unmistakable words, Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, personal, for immediate hand delivery. Reddington blinked. "What is this?" he demanded. Reeves didn't answer. He simply held the envelope out with both hands, posture straight, eyes locked forward as if delivering orders to a flag officer. "It's for her," Reeves said quietly. Grace accepted the envelope without ceremony. She didn't open it. Instead, she set it on the table and nudged it gently toward the colonel. "You should read it, sir." Reddington hesitated, glancing from her face to the seal. Something flickered in his expression, confusion first, then irritation, then an unease he could no longer hide. Still, he tore the envelope open with a sharp rip and pulled out the documents. The room fell into a deep, ringing silence. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. Then he stopped breathing altogether. The color drained from his face so quickly it was as if someone had pulled a plug. His mouth opened once, closed, then opened again without sound. His hand trembled slightly as he looked up at Grace, horror dawning slowly, painfully, irrevocably. On the page, in bold letters, it read, Admiral Grace Callahan, United States Navy Joint Operations Oversight Authority, Special Inspector for Interbranch Readiness and Command. Conduct, there was no misunderstanding it, no room to pretend. No way to undo a week of arrogance, insults, and humiliation. Behind him, Lawson and Bennett had stepped into the doorway and froze when they saw the header. Their backs straightened instinctively. Reeves snapped to a crisp, silent attention. Reddington's voice finally scraped out of his throat, barely audible. "Eh, Admiral?" Grace met his eyes with the same quiet calm she had carried since the moment she arrived. "Yes, Colonel." He swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing as if he were choking on the word. I didn't know." "That," Grace said softly, "is exactly why I came here." For a long, breathless moment, no one in the room moved. Major Bennett was the first to react. The realization hit her like a physical shock, straightening her spine before her mind fully caught up. She snapped to attention so sharply her chair scraped the floor. Command Sergeant Major Holt, who had stepped into the doorway behind her, mirrored the motion instantly, instinct overriding every other thought. Lawson followed a heartbeat later, chest lifting, shoulders locked. Reddington stood frozen, still gripping the letter as though it might burn through his skin. His eyes shifted from page to Admiral Callahan's calm face, then back again, unable to reconcile the two identities. Grace lifted one hand, palm down, her tone gentle, yet commanding enough to shift the air in the room. "Please, all of you. Sit." The words were soft, but the authority behind them carried the unmistakable weight of years in command. Bennett obeyed immediately, lowering herself into the nearest chair with controlled, almost reverent movements. Holt followed, settling slowly, his gaze locked on the Admiral with a new understanding in his eyes. Even Lawson sat, though he looked like he was still trying to process the shift from consultant to Admiral in a single breath. Reddington remained standing, knees unsteady. He finally tried to speak. "Admiral, if I had known, I never meant." The sentence crumbled before it could form. His voice cracked, small and broken, stripped of all the swagger and volume he had used all week. Grace stepped forward slightly, not enough to intimidate, but enough to make him face her fully. "Colonel," she said quietly, "please put the report down." His fingers loosened slowly, the pages rustling as he set them on the table like fragile glass. She let a few seconds pass, letting the silence settle. When she spoke again, her voice carried no anger, no triumph, no need to humiliate in return. "I came here under a civilian cover, because I needed to see how you treated people you believed had no value," she said, "not generals. Not inspectors, not flag officers. Just people." Reddington swallowed hard but said nothing. "I watched how you spoke to your soldiers," she continued. "How quickly you dismissed their concerns. How you cut off your officers when they tried to speak honestly. How you used your rank to silence problems instead of solving them. Bennett's jaw tightened at the truth of it. I saw intimidation used as leadership. I saw fear replacing trust. I saw reports polished until they sparkled while the truth underneath cracked. Grace's eyes didn't waver. I witnessed morale bending under the weight of numbers that looked perfect on paper but meant nothing in the field. Reddington opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I was just trying to maintain standards, he whispered. She shook her head slightly. Standards aren't upheld through fear, Colonel. They're upheld through respect, honesty, and accountability, none of which I saw from you. He broke then, the truth hitting him harder than any reprimand ever could. His shoulders sagged, the facade collapsing. I didn't know who you were, he said weakly. That is the point, she replied. You treated me exactly as you treat anyone you think can't hurt your career. That told me everything I needed to know about your command climate. No raised voice, no theatrical scolding. Just the steady, unyielding truth spoken with the calmness of someone who had led through storms far bigger than this. Reddington lowered his gaze. For the first time, the colonel who had spent an entire week belittling others had nothing left to stand on. A quiet stillness filled the room. Then a single, sharp sound broke it. Petty Officer Jonah Reeves stepped forward and rendered a crisp, flawless salute to Admiral Grace Callahan. Not a hesitant gesture, not a symbolic acknowledgement. A full military salute given with pride, respect, and the weight of everything he had suspected from the beginning. Grace returned it with a small nod. Bennett stood again, emotion tightening her throat, and saluted next. Holt followed, slow but steady, the respect in his eyes deep and sincere. Lawson rose afterward, his salute trembling slightly with the rush of realization and admiration. One by one, each person in the room mirrored the gesture, their movements slow, heavy with meaning. Not because they had to, not because of her rank alone, but because the truth of who she was had settled over them like a dawn breaking after a long night, and for the first time since she arrived on the base, they truly saw her. An admiral, a leader, and a woman who had walked quietly among them, measuring not their numbers but their character. When the meeting ended, Grace didn't walk out with the heavy footsteps of someone delivering punishment. She left the room with the same calm, steady pace she had carried since the day she arrived. Behind her, the officers remained silent, still processing what they had witnessed, not just a reveal, but a lesson. She spent the next hour filing her final notes with higher command. But instead of focusing on revenge or retribution, she made a point that surprised even those who had already grown to respect her. She asked for protections, not punishments. Major Bennett, Captain Lawson, and Command Sergeant Major Holt spoke honestly when given the chance, she told the reviewing board over a secured line. They should not suffer for another man's fear. Their integrity deserves safeguarding. Her tone carried no anger, only resolve. As for Colonel Reddington, she did not recommend the crushing blow some might have expected. She chose a path that balanced consequence with the chance for growth. His record would be corrected. His inflated metrics would be audited. His command climate would be addressed with mandatory oversight and leadership retraining. He would be held accountable, deeply, but not destroyed. Grace had seen enough careers end in bitterness to know that sometimes a man needed correction more than ruin. Later that afternoon, she walked into the dining hall during lunch. Conversations quieted as she entered, soldiers pausing mid-bite, mid-sentence, mid-thought. Word had spread, not loudly, not officially, but through the quiet channels that carried the truth faster than any broadcast ever could. She didn't make a speech, didn't stand on a chair or call attention to herself. She simply moved from table to table, speaking softly to the soldiers who had watched her all week without knowing who she really was. A private asked if the broken radios would finally get fixed. "They will," Grace said gently. A young specialist asked if things would change. "They already have," she replied. A sergeant asked how she stayed so calm when the colonel mocked her. Grace offered a small, thoughtful smile. "Because his words never defined my worth. For many soldiers in that room, Those words meant more than any medal or ribbon could. When she eventually stepped outside into the fading light, the narrator's voice would later say, "It was as if the base exhaled for the first time in years." The weight that had hung over the place, unseen but deeply felt, finally began to lift. And from that moment on, her presence lingered not as the admiral who caught a colonel off guard, but as the leader who reminded them of something simple, something true, something the military sometimes forgot in the noise of rank and protocol: humility isn't weakness. Quiet strength often outshines the loudest authority. And pride, when left unchecked, can rot even the strongest command from the inside out. So the story leaves us with one final thought, one final truth spoken not just for soldiers, but for anyone who has ever judged too quickly or spoken too loudly. Honor isn't proven when the room is watching. It's proven when you think no one is. Leadership isn't just about rank, and respect isn't something earned through volume or fear. It's in the quiet moments, the ones without witnesses, where character truly shows itself. Stories like this remind us that the strongest leaders are often the ones who don't need to announce who they are. They let their actions speak, their humility guide them, and their integrity shine when no one is paying attention. As you think about this story, take a moment to reflect on how you treat the people around you, not just those above you, but those you might overlook. Sometimes the person you dismiss is carrying more responsibility, more courage, and more history than you could ever imagine. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These stories keep the courage alive for generations to come